Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Julieta Brambila is professor of communication on leave at Universidad de las Américas, Puebla, in Mexico. Mariana Sanchez, a doctoral student at American University and an external affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Julieta in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffen Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television and Film, the Latina and Latino Studies program, and the program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen native tribes, and it is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works toward building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Mariana will tell us more about Julieta's research and career in just a minute. Then Julieta will deliver her seminar. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at any point in time. Mariana will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us. And without further ado, Mariana, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Professor Pablo. It is my honor to introduce Professor Julieta Brambila. Professor Brambila holds a BA in Communication from Universidad Panamericana, a master's degree in Political Science from El Colegio de México, and a PhD in Media and Communications from the University of Leeds. In the past months, Professor Brambila worked first as the Information Director of the Ministry of Finance in Mexico, and later as the Chief of Communication and Spokeswoman to the Ministry of Finance of Mexico federal government. Her professional experience, as well as her scholarship, has focused on how journalists exercise their freedom of expression in Mexico. She has worked with civil society and international development agencies to address this topic. She is also currently working on her book that is linked to today's presentation, a very important subject to talk about in today's Mexican public affairs. Welcome, Professor Julieta.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mariana, for your presentation. And thank you also to Pablo and all the people who make possible this virtual seminar. It's a great honor to me to be here and to have the opportunity to share with all you parts of this research that I started some years ago when I was doing my PhD in the UK, but later on this has become a more insightful research that's gonna be published hopefully next year by Columbia University Press. And let me start by making a reference to the title of this presentation, that is The Journalism Paradox, and how journalists persevere and actually keep working amidst an atmosphere of repression and violence in Mexico. So in the next slide, as you can see, I can do, and I do actually some reference to this paradox in which Mexican society is living through, but particularly the field of journalism. And this paradox, I would argue, has been reshaping the field of journalism in too many ways. We have in Mexico huge numbers of people living in different forms of inequality and poverty. We have as well a great dissatisfaction with democratic institutions. We also have in many ways a broken judicial and security institutions, raising levels of criminality, as well as an unprecedented wave of anti-press violence. And at the same time, in the context of this crisis, and probably because of this, a generation of journalists and media outlets have become more independent, more critical, and more collaborative than ever before. They have learned to navigate political and criminal intimidations and human rights abuses. In contemporary Mexico, told me Diego Enrique Sorno, an award-winning Mexican journalist, there is a lot of censorship, a lot of intimidation, a profound working precarity, and at the same time, there is a lot of vitality, creativity, and in many ways, dissidence in the news media. And this is the paradox from which this research starts, because as is true in other parts in life, for journalism, probably some way to achieve the best kind of reporting are those challenging moments and uncertain moments that the field of journalism is passing through at this moment. As it shows in the next slide, the history of many crises in society and in humankind always leave the door open to new opportunities. Actually, the history of crisis also taught us that humans, as agents of change, have a great capacity to resist, to adapt, and to transform their own environment. And this is also true for journalists, and particularly for journalists in Mexico. But now we are facing very important moments in the field of journalism, and you can see also in the next slide. And this presentation, actually, I wanted to divide it in two things. First is to answer this question, what is that is going on here? Very a sociological question about this wave of anti-press violence that is happening in the country. And in the second part of the presentation, I will actually try to explain how to a group of journalists that I call resilient newsmakers are doing quality type of journalism in their own communities. So for a start with the first part, as you can see in the next slide, from public humiliation, online harassment, and political intimidation to surveillance, imprisonment, and murder, press freedom and journalistic autonomy in Mexico is under attack. Mexico stands out as the most dangerous democracy for journalists in Latin America, and probably in the Western Hemisphere. Anti-press violence here is defined as the physical attacks, verbal intimidations, and threats against news journalists and news media outlets as a result of their work. As a social phenomenon, historian John Heron says, anti-press violence says something about the historical moment in which we are inhabited. And this is part of key elements of these, to understanding these waves of attacks against the press. This wave has some regularities, some patterns. that I want to refer to in order to understand a little bit more this complex phenomenon. Since 2006, there is one journalist killed every month, and this tendency hasn't decreased or changed in the last years. For every journalist that has been killed, press freedom organizations have also documented at least 35 to 40 attacks against journalists and news media outlets. I mean here different kinds of attacks, threats, and others. This kind of violence and anti-press violence has been deployed in very uneven way through all the Mexican territory, as you can see in this map. Cases of anti-press violence rise specifically in some parts of the country, some municipalities and specific states like Veracruz, Chihuahua, Guerrero, Oaxaca, Michoacán. And when we look, the same kind of attacks probably 40 or 50 years ago in journalism in Mexico, they are probably in many ways in similar places as this one. Actually, in some parts that are the same municipalities, because these are strategic points in many ways in Mexico, in terms of exit routes to the US, for instance, or entry routes to Mexico by the sea, but also strategic places in order to political purposes and control. So these are patterns that has been there for a while. And also not all journalists are similarly exposed to risk of violence, specifically those journalists who cover topics like abuse of power, corruption, crime, criminal organization and criminal crime as well, human rights violations are specifically targeted with this kind of violence. And this is important because actually all these topics are the topics probably that are more in necessity and more in need in a place like Mexico. But also, as we can see in the next one, anti-press violence is symptomatic of something else. When a journalist is murdered, implies that the level of violence and impunity is rather high, as well as the severity of the problems, told me a political journalist from Morelia. For some academics and also scholars like Sally Hughes and others, these kind of places, they have a name when they have a polity with democratic institutions. They call it insecure democracies, which are democratic settings with serious problems in terms of public insecurity, uneven development of political institutions, impunity, poverty, and they say Mexico, for taking together this definition, is an example of an insecure democracy. And I totally agree with them. Mexican case also shows that democratic polities, in comparison with authoritarian regime, may introduce some institutional, cultural, economic, political incentives for developing critical journalism. However, the Mexican case also shows that under certain circumstances and certain conditions, new democracies seems to offer a lethal trap to journalists who enjoy certain incentives to perform a more critical role in society than probably previous regimes, but where the state is unable to safeguard the exercise of journalism all over its territory. And let me put an emphasis in this severity of the problems that this journalist is referring to. And what I will argue in the next slides is that the journalistic field has become an increasingly dangerous place for journalism due to different developments that are either outside the journalistic field or inside the journalistic field. In the outside category, we have, just to mention, an unchecked democratization that I already referred to, the rise of subnational authoritarian governments in many parts in the country, in which, despite the fact that at the national level, Mexico has become an electoral democracy, in many parts of the country, all the same guarantees, including the exercise of press freedom, is more intermittent and very limited. And by the way, this is not only that is happening or political scientists find in Mexico, but actually a trend in many federal states or federal countries, which has been in a process of democratization in the last 20 years. In Latin America, there are many cases like this. The third major development, I would say, is what Andreas Schedler calls criminal civil war. That is this confrontation that starts 15 years ago, first between Mexican governments against some powerful drug cartels and drug trafficking organizations in the country. But as the time has been passing, this conflict has evolved in a very complicated criminal civil war in which are involved not only these actors, but also authorities that are being corrupt and they are colluded with the criminals and other developments. This, of course, has created a wave of anti-press violence, but more importantly, for understanding all this phenomenon, this has created also a human rights crisis in the country. And the fourth major development is economic law performance and unevenness in the access to digital infrastructure in all the Mexican territory. Inside the journalistic field, there are also some developments and some trends that actually has been made the field more risky for journalists and overall newsmakers. We have an increasingly high rates occupational role models without any standards in terms of like homogenization of these models. So we have probably a vast majority of journalists with a kind of passive practices in journalism, as well as a critical coverage of political actors. And this, of course, increases the level of political instrumentalization in the field. As in other parts in the world, in Mexico, there is a business model that is broken, and this crisis in the business model has made media more dependent probably than ever from government money and other sources that could limit their editorial practices. And at the same time, it's increasingly precarious the way not only journalists, but also other creative industries work in Mexico. And again, this is not only a trend that we can see in Mexico, but actually a phenomenon that is in the global south, but also in the north. When we look inside the field, we will see a field that is very fragmented, with very low levels of solidarity within journalists, and also low levels of social support from society to journalists. And you can see that in the public demonstrations against crimes against journalists, in which are actually made of journalists and activists, but not citizens or simple people who care about this. And at the top of all this, also an increasingly digital visibility that could be a phenomenon lead to risk in many parts of the country, especially in those places in which communities are more close and in which everybody made to know everybody in many simple ways. So all this creates, as you can see in the following, an atmosphere of intolerance and intimidation. And we can see that if we see the slide and the perpetrators of attacks against journalists in Mexico. And this atmosphere, of course, has many consequences for journalists as persons, but for journalism as a social institution that plays a role in society and in democratic settings, particularly. As we can see in the next one, this atmosphere creates and enables silence, fear, vulnerability. In a representative survey to Mexican journalists conducted 3 years ago, they found that at least 70% of journalists have adopted some form of self-censorship in the last 5 years. And they adopt that mainly as a protective factor in order to as like a survival mechanism. This, of course, represents series of obstacles to the viability of Mexico's democracy, but also these, I will argue, have represented a major challenge inside the field and have in some ways reconfigured the way strategic parts of Mexican journalists and Mexican journalists who are doing probably some of the best kind of journalism in Mexico work. As we can see in the next one, this is something that told me a crime beat reporter from El Diario de Juárez, which is the most relevant newspaper in Ciudad Juárez. Of course, we all are afraid. Of course, we all are fighting it. But we have always thought that to stop making journalism is the worst thing that could happen. And then she was referring in the conversation that actually she covered the murder of two of her colleagues in Ciudad Juárez 8 years ago. And yes, this is something that actually is there in many ways, in many forms, in the field of journalism in Mexico. They have been through a lot of pain and a lot of trauma, but also they have found in their own crafts a way to be resilient against all these adversities. As we can see in the next one, what I've been doing in the presentation is until now just explaining a bit more about what is happening, but the following minutes I want to devote the time to answer these questions. Actually, how do journalists adapt and continue reporting, and how do journalists acquire political consciousness and become agents of discontents in their own communities? And for doing this, as you can see in the next slide, I came with empirical category that I call resilient newsmaker. That, as you can read, is a heterogeneous generation of journalists who has been capable to developing a meaningful capacity to adapt, and more importantly, to pursue a kind of civic-oriented behavior through both following cautious professional tactics and becoming agents of discontent. This empirical category is made of different developments in different areas, from journalism to sociology to political science. The idea of meaningful capacity to adapt comes from a study made by two psychologists, actually, Novak and Davidson, 7 years ago, about how journalists who face violence and trauma have found that identifying with their professional role appears to be a protective factor in dealing with hazards. This, of course, somehow reminds us of an old saying: what doesn't kill journalists makes them stronger. The idea of civic-oriented behavior came from my teacher and dear friend, Sally Hughes, who came across with this concept of civic journalism a la mexicana, as she called it, in her very influential work about how Mexican journalism transformed 20 years ago in a moment of democratic openness and also economic liberalization. For her, different groups of journalists coming from different backgrounds changed the way they do journalism and the way journalists has been doing in their own newsrooms by pursuing a type of journalism that was more assertive, independent, and diverse than never before. As the resilient newsmakers that I'm talking here, these are not the majority of journalists in Mexico, and actually there are a very minimum part of the field, but a very significant one for democratic purposes and for the strengths of democracy. Frida Rodello is a researcher based in Mexico who conducted research 10 years ago about how journalists in Sinaloa actually keep working in very difficult situations. And she developed this concept of cautious type of journalism that are some of the kind of ideas, strategies that they follow in order to keep publishing. And this presentation and this research also took that part from them. And finally, since Karl Marx, but others developed more recent developments in political science and sociology, there is also the idea that at some points, classes, communities, or fields become more aware about the political place in society, and specifically in the moments of uncertainty, but also in the moments of great attacks against them. Actually, they become more conscientious about their political aim in their own community, and become later on in agents of discontent, I will argue. So this category of resilient newsmakers is not referring to a type of journalism. What I'm arguing here is that is a way in which committed and independent journalism has reacted to unprecedented challenges in their own communities. Resilient newsmakers are, by definition, very hybrid. Hybridity in the terms of aims is to say in terms of the objectives that they follow in order to do journalism. They came with different ideas of what is journalism and what is for. As long as they are autonomous, proactive, and diverse, I will consider in this category. Hybridity in the forms, including different types of journalism, from beat crime reporters to investigative reporters to so-called cronistas, which develop a kind of literary journalism. And also they came from a quite diverse type of media outlets, from legacy news organization to digital news startups to freelance and so on. They are not united in common aspiration of achieving a better democracy, as Hughes found 20 years ago, but to overcome fear what has been a catalyst in their desire of cooperation and empathy was also a desire to confront their own reality. Was what brought them together were rage, outrage, and a very deep desire of justice as well. And these resilient newsmakers, as we can see in the next slide, use what Bourdieu and others call capital. In field theory, capital are the material and symbolic resources that journalists rely upon to produce news stories and enable professional practice. Journalists have the capacity to transform one form of capital into another, pursuing some objectives or strategies that they want to follow. In journalism, Benson and others argue that the most important type of capital is symbolic capital. However, this symbolic capital is made of three types of capital: cultural, organizational, and social. Cultural capital is closely related to personal professional experiences and refers to the skills, technical expertise, general knowledge, and tactics that are relevant for journalists covering news beats. Of course, here we can talk about years of professional experiences, but also very meaningful experiences when doing their own work, and particularly experiences dealing with hazardous situations, risky environments, and even violence. Organizational capital might be defined as institutional assets that individual journalists rely upon to produce news stories, including their income and level of warranty for work, their position in the organizational hierarchy, and the level of editorial and management support they enjoy to produce news. And social capital is the level of professional connections and solidarity within peers. Professional solidarity in the journalistic field may be defined as a sense of agreement in horizontal and mutual support among field members. And as you can imagine, it's very complicated to achieve, especially in places like Mexico, with a legacy of clientelism and other forms of direct and indirect infiltration in the field of journalism. So here, the main proposition, as you can see in the next slide, is this one. Higher levels of capital enable for deploying strategic behaviors to enhance their autonomy as journalists, but also as members of their own community, as a professionals, and also I would say as an agents of discontent in society. For this, and actually all the research, as you can see in the next slide, is made of some methods. I will pass very quickly through this. I interview first some key informants made up of top journalists, investigative reporters, based mainly in Mexico City, but who usually cover this kind of topics that I referred before, like corruption, crime, human rights abuses, from different parts in the country. I also interview activists and public officials. And then I conduct an open-ended questionnaire to 49 journalists from different locations in the country, from 10 states and 21 cities. These journalists were selected because actually they were covering also this type of reporting in their own communities, but actually they used to work either for a national news media that is based in Mexico City, but the journalists were operating and living actually in these states, and we call it corresponsales nacionales. And they developed kind of beat journalism, like diarismo, I mean like kind of reporting of current affairs every day, but also they try to engage in longer investigative pieces for their own media outlets. And in this, for this questionnaire, I also pick some journalists working in relevant news media in their own communities, either legacy newspapers as El Siglo de Torreón en Coahuila, o el Diario de Juárez en Chihuahua, El Mañana in Tamaulipas, but also some news startups in many parts of the country, Rio 12 in Sinaloa, for instance. And actually, in the next slide, we can see geographical location of these journalists as I conduct the fieldwork. So in the next slide, you see in the map, for instance, how these journalists has been, where they were working at the time of the interview. And in the next one, something that is relevant for this research, as you can see in the next slide, is that many of these journalists actually face very traumatic environments and traumatic moments. As you can see in the next one, 30 of the 49 journalists that I interview have passed through different types of violence during their professional career, from political intimidation to other forms, more violent and extreme forms of violence. If we can change for the next slide. Thank you. And here you can see more or less how is divided these forms of threats and violence. And then back to the main part, to the presentation. In the following slide, you can see what I call this professional autonomy. If we can see the next one, please. What is called the strategies for safety autonomy. And actually talking with these journalists, I realized that in many ways, this came with this strategic behavior in empirical terms, actually by developing their own craft in many ways. One journalist in Tamaulipas told me, I have learned to move carefully in the limits markets between the government sphere and the crime spheres. And he told me that in a moment in which Tampico and Tamaulipas overall was facing a very tough situation with criminal gangs, but also with political intimidation in many forms. One journalist in Sinaloa referred to this as a survival instincts that they acquired in the field. And after that, they developed a set of strategies that we can call, and we can mention here, like cautious logistics, wherever they move to a certain places, negotiate some kind of access to places in which either criminals or other de facto groups have the control. Strategic silence, meaning that sometimes they cannot publish or they cannot just publish the material that they have until something changed the local status quo in terms of politics or criminality. So after that, probably they are able to publish something. And some others, like Diego Enrico Sorno that I mentioned at the beginning, but many others, came to develop a kind of literary journalism that I call chronicas here. And this type of chronicas, they say, they argue, are better suitable to understand and actually to portray the reality that they are facing. In the organizational sphere and the organizational capital, there were also a learning group, a learning curve, specifically among those newspapers and news outlets that were actually very committed to do an important role, to play an important role in their own society. They, for this, need, of course, economic independence from the government, and as you can imagine, is complicated and difficult to achieve in many parts in Mexico. But when they rely upon that, actually they develop these strategies. We did all that, said to me a top editor at El Siglo de Torreón. We learned that physical safety measures were not enough. We had to learn how to publish material without attracting retaliation from criminal gangs and others. And this is something that actually were mentioned by others, chief editors and managers in other parts in the country, in Sinaloa as well, but also in Veracruz and Michoacán. One top editor in Sinaloa told me that at some moments they decided to keep reporting about the criminal atmosphere in where they were living and passing through, but not from the point of view of the problems of criminality at that moment itself, but rather from the point of view of the deep causes of this violence or the many social consequences of that. They also develop or acquire different editorial policies like anonymous publications, management monitoring, saying that they were very key about where their most probably relevant journalists or the journalists who were dealing with these issues were at the moment of reporting, always having an eye upon them. And in the social capital sphere, many of these journalists develop what I call this collective trusted journalism that in some ways is a manner to find empathy with others and develop this kind of journalism. If someone can't publish a news story about something that is going on their own state, they try and transmit it to others in a way of sharing news, told me this political reporter in Chihuahua. And actually sharing news or sharing content is gonna be an important news is something that has been happening in recent years, not only in Mexico, but in different parts. But the adoption of this, I would argue in the case of Mexico, is due mainly to this atmosphere of repression. They also develop other kind of strategies, collective monitoring, where they don't enjoy the monitoring from an organization. They actually monitoring within them in order to have an eye in their own colleagues, wherever they are conducting a very high risk assignments. But also these strategies, as we can see in the next slide, were not only applied to do better journalism or quality journalism, but also strategies for dissent and actually deploy a kind of contestation and protest in society. And this starts probably from the own journalists in their interior, in their own feelings. These journalists from Guerrero told me, despite all those circumstances, you have to keep on fighting. And he was at that moment a refugee in other part, in other state in Mexico, because he received the threats from organized crime in Acapulco, Guerrero. Later on, he moved and actually he started to investigating and publishing important material about other parts in the country, about human rights violations that after time became one of the major histories in recent years in the country. So many journalists actually make sense about what been happening to them, finding a way of a meaningful resilience or something similar to that, and finding also in their own protective factors probably the elements that keep that led them to keep continuing doing their own work. In the organizational capital realm, I would say that also, as in the case of a strategic behavior to keep publishing and writing, those organizations that were financially independent were able to probably have a commitment, a very deep commitment and sense of responsibility with their own journalists and their own crafts, and also to deploy some kind of contestation and protest whatever happened to their own colleagues. This is an investigative reporter from magazine Proceso, that is the most influential political magazine in the country. We were already reunited there with the governor. He's speaking about the governor of Veracruz, headed by the founder of the magazine, Julio Scherer, and the director. And at the reunion, he comments, they told you to the governor that we are not going to believe anything until they tell us what exactly what happened to their own colleague. And he was referring here to a meeting that they have with this governor in Veracruz after the killing of one of his colleagues, Regina Martinez, in Veracruz in 2011. And they have this reunion, but after that, they not only protest about this in the magazine and also in the streets in Mexico, but they, after time, they collaborate with other news media in Mexico and beyond to actually try to not only to understand what happened to Regina Martinez, but also to keep reporting the same issues that she was reporting at the time of her murder. And this is just an example, and a case, but it's something that actually is happening somehow in other parts in the country in this organizational level. And in the realm of social capital, many of the journalists actually, after receiving what I call like a grievance against them, like an attack against journalists, they came together in a sort of empathy and solidarity, creating networks that has been useful not only to share experiences, but also to organize as a political agents and political agents in their own communities. Later on, these networks also became like organizations in which journalists can share, for instance, different protocols for keep reporting in many harassment situations and so on. So just for finishing the presentation, as you can see in the next slides, there are, of course, several structural limitations to this strategic behavior. And it's something that is happening in the country, but that is not massive in the kind that is in all the journalistic field. We still have a lot of submissive role values and performances in journalism, high financial dependency from journalism to money coming from governments and other sources that can limit their own craft, but also a very suffocating atmospheres and overarching fears in many parts of the country. And so just to finish and let and have some space for feedback or comments from you, the concluding remarks in the last slide is like this is a way probably to go out from the paradox, to looking at the forms of capital that journalists have to their disposition. Agency is possible in repressive environments, but is contingent to many factors, as also the ways in which they acquire these forms of capital. Resilience Newsmaker is not a type of journalism, but a way to confront reality by doing journalism and actually creating citizenship. About the roles of capital, it is expected that social capital became increasingly relevant in following years for resilient newsmakers. As you can imagine, many legacy news organizations are in a very critical situation in the country. And actually also the murder of Javier Valdez, who was a very important and relevant journalist in Mexico that happened 4 years ago, actually creates a massive wave of discontent and the creation and lead to the creation of some organizational mechanism for journalists in many parts in the country. And the ongoing vitality of journalism in the country, even in an extreme situation as this one, lies in the capacity of journalists not only to generate empathy within them, but also to create bridges with society and other civic allies in society that believe in the same values and in the same aims of journalism in democratic societies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Brambila. I'm gonna open the floor for Q&A. So if anyone wants to do a question, just I want to remind you that you can do it in the function of Q&A. And I do have a question. At the beginning, you were mentioning this was an insecure democracy. And I would like to ask first, and then I will open it also for my colleagues, is what do you think about the political regime? O sea, the political regime matters, or is this more profoundly involved in a system? If the political regime changes, does this also change like the whole environment for journalists, or is this more like embedded in the system and it's unchangeable? That is the first question. And now let me open the floor for Mora. She also has a question. You want to open your microphone?
I do, but however, please let Julieta answer, and then I will come with mine because mine is totally different. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Mora, and thank you, Mariana. And well, I think it's a complicated answer because there are several very deep structures in Mexico, as you may know, that came from from the authoritarian regime, and they are still in place, especially at the local level. So, and this hasn't changed with the arrival of a democracy 20 years ago. However, the incentives that journalists acquired to do a more assertive and critical performance, they acquired that exactly because now we are living in a time in which they are a society which want to know more about what is happening. There is a market to that, but also a shared values to conduct that. So I think regime types are important, but probably more importantly to this actually is like a cultural transformation in the practices that is way beyond the states and the government.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go with my question. Thank you so much, Professor Brambila, for this very important presentation. I have different questions and they all relate to the idea of social media. So first of all, the literature on social media, and not only related to politics, but just in general, has been very much focused since the beginning on the relation between social media use and social capital, right? Like there's this idea that somehow social media use can enlarge a person's social capital and that people use social media for that purpose, etc. So I want to ask you, how do you see the role of social media in connecting to any kind of the three capital forms that you described as being key for the resilience that journalists build in Mexico?
Okay, great question. And actually, it's quite important. is quite relevant. And I would say the importance of this actually probably is more relevant in the social capital realm, as you mentioned. Actually, I was thinking in using a different kind of name to mention this kind of capital, labeling networked capital, because actually is what you are doing with that. But also, and this is probably something that in social movement has been there for a while, that there is some differences between treating probably something or try to have a kind of organization that is only virtual and actually go to the streets, especially in places, not like Mexico City, but especially in places, in some municipalities in Veracruz or in Sinaloa or in Tamaulipas, in which by doing that, you actually are doing something that may come you with a lot of problems with the government, but also with criminals. And so technologies, as I see them, are relevant probably as a first connector, and actually probably a space to do more things. But the empathy that they create actually is an empathy that came more from a deep conversation of sharing these very challenging situations that they have been passing through.
Thank you very much. There's a question in the chat, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, there's a question in the chat, so let me read it very quickly. This is from Kendra Carreon. If democracies are becoming increasingly dangerous for journalists, what are their prospects for protection? Could some pressure be exerted through international NGOs or organizations? Would that be enough to guarantee journalists' safety for the exercise of their jobs?
Okay, thank you, Kendra. And I don't have, I think, good positive feelings or to answer this question, because not all democracies are equally insecure to journalists. As the category that developed Hughes and others is this kind of democracy, like the Mexican democracy, Central America, Brazil, and others, in which you actually have all these incentives to do a very good type of reporting, but actually you have a very embedded structural phenomenon in the States. It's for sure that this is a phenomenon that in many ways overlap with other things in the global north. No, we can see what's happening in the US or in England, in other parts, with the arrival of these populist regimes. However, at the end, in Mexico, not only journalists are at risk, actually everybody are at risk, and this is probably one of the main differences. And now about the mechanisms to protect journalists, there has been there for a while. In the last 15 years, Mexico and other countries have created these mechanisms to protect journalists, and also special prosecutors' offices to end impunity. But what is happening in all these institutions is what is happening as well overall in other state institutions. Impunity is at the very high levels, not only in crimes against journalists, but in crimes in general. And this is something that we need to be very aware, because if we want to change impunity in crimes against journalists, actually, we want to change first probably impunity against crimes to every citizens in society, not because they are only equally important, but because they are parts of the same system, of the same judicial system. And this is probably the main problem.
We have one last question from Celeste in the chat. She wants to ask you about some of the effects in the profession of journalism. You mentioned that all this trauma and tragedy led many journalists to develop solidarity, empathy, and bypass other differences. Do you think that because of this, the Mexican journalist sphere might be able to surpass some of the challenges of other Latin American news spheres that are very polarized?
Thank you, Celeste. And I don't know, because at the end of the day, these changes and this transformation that I'm seeing in Mexican journalism are in very strategic parts of the field. Probably these journalists that are very committed to their own craft, but certainly it's not a general tendency in the news media. And probably in different ecosystems and different countries, there are also some kind of resilient newsmakers in different ways, confronting different realities, making journalism that is quality journalism and important type of reporting. But the things that came them together were different than in Mexico. Certainly in Mexico, these journalists came together and they shared their experiences, and they try to find ways to actually overcome that atmosphere because of the fears, because of the atmosphere in which they were living and passing through.
So much, Julieta. This has been a very, very important seminar. Thank you, Mariana, first of all, for great introduction and moderation. This is a very, very important topic, and I would dare to say that applies not only to Mexico, but to many other parts of countries in Latin America and other parts of the world. So thank you for sharing your very important research with us. Thank you to the audience for staying with us through the end. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your day and week. And I invite people to join us next week for the next seminar of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.